All right, welcome to week 2, everyone, in our reading the Bible through a year. Here's our next episode of covering the text, going over some observations. So it's good to have you guys. I think I decided to name this the Between Two Bibles. And so here we have between our two Bibles today is little Luther. So he'll be with us with the text. Martin Luther, 16th century reformer, small catechism, he's not the reason why we're called Lutherans, but his name's attached to it.
And he was big on reading the Bible too.
Yeah.
So
I always love both seminaries have a Luther statue. The St. Louis one, he's pounding on his Bible, and the other one has an open Bible with him kind of pointing at it. So, here we are, reading through our Bibles too. So, good stuff. So, the Word of God here we're with today. And thanks again for joining me again too, Dana, as we dig into the text and kind of bounce things back and forth. We got done with week 1 here, and just some of the, we're digging into some observations too. What are some of the things that you kind of noticed as we went through? We had actually a lot of people, some of you guys gave us observations too. So what do we see?
One thing I noticed that I had never really thought about before, but I felt was that Noah had siblings. Because it says his father, Lamech, had Noah and then had other sons and daughters, and then he died. The typical genealogy as Genesis goes, which I thought that was interesting. It kind of reminded me of when I realized that Peter had a wife because he had a mother-in-law and then he had a wife.
Right.
Just to think of the family relationships that some of these people have, because you think of it's just Noah. But, so you wonder if his siblings or his father or grandfather helped with the ark, if they were also believers and died before the flood came, or if they were unrighteous and died in the flood, or it's I thought that was kind of an interesting thing to think about, because I know either his father or his grandfather died the year of the flood, if you do the genealogies right.
Is that Methuselah?
I think it was Methuselah, the grandfather. So you kind of wonder, what were his siblings like? How many did he have? Did they help?
Right. Well, this makes them real people too, right? Yeah. It's kind of like, it was a reminder, like, oh yeah, these people lived in, like Paul, he had, was it a sister, I think, because he's back in Jerusalem, and his sister actually warns him about an impending,
I haven't caught that one before.
I'd have to go look that up, but Paul has a sister, and you're like, when's the last time you thought about Paul having a family or sister? Because we know he's not married, but, he had other family too, brothers and sisters and whatnot.
Being an only child was unusual, actually.
So. Yeah, especially in that culture too. Yeah, so another observation I noticed, this gets into maybe a couple of the questions here too, because we talked about Cain and Abel. But Cain, he's a worker of the ground, so he's kind of like that farmer idea, at least a vine tender and things like that. And we're told that he offers up his from the ground, food from the ground, and then Abel offers up the fat and the first choices from the animals. And the Lord has regard for Abel's and not regard for Cain's. And I've always got, one of the things I caught is that just in the previous chapter, right, God had just cursed the ground. And here Cain is taking that which is cursed from the ground and trying to kind of offer it up. Just kind of, maybe a part of the text that kind of cues us into why Cain's is also not kind of accepted in that, get the rest of the Bible, Hebrews, Cain did not offer his up in faith. So he's kind of just like, here you go.
Because Abel offered up the firstborn of his animals, which actually the chapter right before, God also presumably killed the first animal to clothe Adam and Eve in garments. So God set the standard for what was an acceptable sacrifice too.
Right.
That does get into the question, why did Cain kill Abel? If you want to cover that now.
Might as well, yeah. We had a question we read on Sunday together, the text, and someone asked that question, why did Cain kill Abel? And there definitely is that kind of a strife, that enmity, the envy. In fact, you get that enmity there. You got that in the previous, your descendant, that seed, your seed and her seed. So you almost kind of get Cain as not the seed. Which kind of fits well with that text with Eve thinking, I've begotten the man. And, maybe Cain had some of those kind of thoughts going in, right? That I'm the chosen one. And, imagine the kind of ego that produces. Head. And so then when you offer up a sacrifice thinking God's going to love this, and all of a sudden he just doesn't even regard it, right? That kind of, imagine what kind of that does to somebody, that anger, right? And then of course God goes to him and says, why do you do well to do angry kind of thing? And I kind of love too in that part, because then sin is also brought in with the same kind of idea. Sin is desire is for you, which is the same curse that God gave to Eve, right? Your desire And it's not so much like it's not a craving, but it's a possession. It's like almost possesses a person to kind of want something. So sin wants Cain, and we find out in the text that sin has Cain, because what does he do? He goes and murders his brother. So out of envy, anger. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is before the 10 Commandments, but this is kind of like Commandments 9 and 10, do not covet.
Right.
Almost coveted what the praise Abel got, maybe, and that led him to murder.
Right.
Usually breaking one commandment leads to a different commandment.
Yeah.
Breaking.
Right. James, right? You break one of the commandments, they're all shattered.
Yeah.
So you see like Cain and Abel, right? You get that also Cain and Abel, the sacrifice that will be Christ, right? The perfect Lamb of God, just like Abel's offering. Was our hymn, Abel's blood for vengeance pleads to skies, but the blood of Jesus for our parting cries. So you kind of get this difference between Abel and Christ, and kind of comparison here, what their spilled blood is doing. Christ's blood pleads for our pardon, unlike Abel's blood that cries up from the ground. So there's a lot you could probably dig into with just that question alone. Just some kind of key observations that you get into that too. So what else? We had some other observations here. What else did you catch?
Another one, I've heard this before, but I always find it interesting. I don't think we mentioned this on the last video, but if you kind of work the genealogies next to each other, it's possible that Noah's father or grandfather could have met Adam. So Adam could have met Noah's father or grandfather, and then also Noah's son Shem could have known Abraham and Isaac, because they would have been kind of alive all at the same time. So that's what people always think, well, how did the story of creation get passed from Adam all the way down to the Israelites? And it could have easily passed from Adam to Noah's father, to Noah, to Shem, to Abraham, and then so it's not as
removed.
It's not as removed. So honestly, most people up until the time of the flood might have known Adam or known someone who knew Adam.
Right.
And I find that kind of a fascinating thing, that because I never really thought about that. It's like, Adam died, and then you have all these other people. It's like, actually, Adam was alive during all this, and so he could have, I wonder what he thought almost of all the sin that he saw the consequences of his actions quite starkly, and
it does make you wonder if kind of like what's going through Adam's head. But I think it was the Talmud, the Jewish tradition says, part of it says that when Adam sinned, before he kicked out of the garden, he got a vision. He got to get shown, kind of almost like Moses seeing the promised land. Like he got to see kind of the results of everything he would do. So kind of that the horror, right? Just he got to witness some of this stuff. We have our own talk about like not being so far removed from events, right? Upham here, one of his kids just died, right? He was a civil war.
Yep.
And that means we were just one generation removed from
someone who fought in the civil war.
So you don't think that's 150 years ago, right? 160 years ago, but yet we know someone who knew someone that was alive, at least. So it's just kind of cool to think about.
Yeah, it's not history isn't as far removed always as we think it is.
Right. Yeah. So good stuff. What some of the observations too that we kind of noticed. But one actually disconnected, and this will be kind of part as we talk about Matthew too, because that's kind of one of the things we forgot last week. Because at the same time, right, we're going through the Gospels as well as reading Genesis. And Genesis really just pairs so well with the beginning of Matthew there, because
the genealogy.
It begins with the genealogy. So we see kind of Jesus being kind of the continuation of this story of these people, and he's bringing about the blessings and the promises. In fact, that's Jesus's first words out preaching as he sits down with his disciples, and he says, "Blessed are these people," right? Just like when God said he blessed them, and he said. So Jesus is kind of continuing that work of God. Now he's giving the blessing to the nations, and not so much the blessing that we think, the rich people are blessed, but he's literally declaring you are blessed. He's not so kind of giving us some social contract or some, nice words to say. He's actually blessing these people who
God's
are
word
this.
Actually does something.
Yeah, so it fits right back into creation.
Yeah, back to Genesis 1.
Yeah, because people usually say Matthew 5, right? This is a law. We got to do this and then we'll be blessed. It's like no. It's just kind of God is blessing these people.
Kind of like the benediction at the end of service too.
Yeah.
We're actually getting blessed by God. It's
right.
not.
Yeah, and
it's actually happening.
Right. It's not just a nice, cute word. Wasn't that just so nice that he said that? It was just like that actually did something. It puts God's name on people. So just other fun observations too. Another one that I saw, Genesis 15, verse 4. I have to look this up. It just kind of caught me as someone else was reading. I was just kind of listening and following along. But it was Genesis 15:4, the first time that the word of the Lord came. Like, we'll get that with the prophets later on in the Old Testament. The word of the Lord came to such and such, saying, go and say this. So that's kind of the first time that you get that. A lot of Christian theology will pick up on this fact that who is this word? Because, it's like a voice from heaven starts speaking. Oh, yeah, we'll do, Lord. The scriptures kind of actually depicted as, here is a person coming in, which is, this is Jesus. So
beginning of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Yeah. So just some of the stuff when you understand that Jesus is everywhere in this Old Testament stuff.
You start seeing it a lot.
You just see it everywhere. So that's probably another thing to pay when we read the scriptures, right? Where's Jesus at? And if you're not finding him on a page, right, just keep that in mind because it will pop. It just kind of comes to mind.
Isn't it one thing that someone said to do that anytime you see Lord in all caps to say Jesus instead? Yeah. Because essentially, the capitalized Lord is Yahweh, right?
Yeah.
It's anytime the official name of God. So you could just say Jesus in those places.
Yeah. Right. This is Acts 2. The Lord, he has made him both God and Lord, this Jesus whom you crucified, so is Lord. And in Philippians 2, right, everyone will bow in heaven and on earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord, right? Jesus is Yahweh. So you get that kind of thought here too in the Old Testament that you should probably put the second person of the Godhead in here. Good stuff. So any other kind of observations that you kind of pointed out? And
I think those were the main ones.
Yeah.
So we only got 2 questions this week. One of them we already covered. Why did Cain kill Abel? And then the other one we kind of covered last week, but since it was asked, I thought we'd reiterate it. Were Adam and Eve created on day 6, and how do Genesis 1 and 2 relate?
Yeah. And that's kind of one of those, it kind of catches people off guard, maybe if they've never read 1 and 2 at the same time. Because, usually in church we'll read chapter 1 and maybe chapter 2 at another date and time. But when you read them both together, you're almost kind of like, well, hold on. Well, what's going on here, right? Because you get the creation of everything, days 1 through 6, and then we're told that God rests. And all of a sudden, like, chapter 2, verse 4 picks up, and we're told that all of a sudden God, there's nothing, that mankind hasn't been created yet. And it's like, what's going on here? And we did talk about that last week, how Hebrew kind of will give us a summary statement about what this was and then kind of extrapolate it.
So like I said, Genesis 1:1 is a summary statement, and then it's extrapolated out in the remaining of chapter 1, and then chapter 2, verse 4, starts with these. This is the account, or this is the, I forget the other way it's worded, but my Bible, this is the account of the heavens and the earth. And so it's just reiterating what happened on day 6, because day 6, the creation of man, was important for the remainder of the story.
Right.
You actually get this a lot in Genesis, a few different places where this is the account of, this is the account of, this is the account of, and usually it's a shift in the story, because I think you get this is the account of Noah, and this is the account of, I think, Abraham too, or this is the account of Shem.
Because I think the word for that actually is we get the word Genesis for it. But, genealogy, the birth, the lineage, even. So this is the lineage of the heavens and the earth. It's just kind of cool if you stop to think about that. It's kind of like, almost like day 1 gives birth to day 2, and then day 2 to day 3, and then day, so it's kind of like father, son, almost in that, just how the rest of the text will kind of go with humans then, which is kind of cool.
So yes, man was created on day 6, and Genesis 2 just is a more detailed look at day 6.
Yeah.
Because chapter 1 is just kind of a general summary of what happened each day.
Yep. So that's but that's really good to reiterate too, because that is kind of a sticking point that we got to keep in mind too. Good. I think that's our 2 questions. Anything else that you kind of think about before we dig in?
That's all I can think of at the moment.
Okay. I did a little bit here, but Matthew, kind of the big theme that you got to get out of Matthew. As you read through that gospel, it's really trying to point out the kingdom of God. That's kind of the big theme. How does God's kingdom work? Who does God's kingdom come to? What is life like in God's kingdom? Jesus will tell us parables. How can we compare the kingdom of God to, and what's it like? And so stuff like that. So when Jesus is speaking, like, how does this fit into the idea of what's life like in God's kingdom? Right? We live in the kingdom of the United States, if you put it that way. What's life like here? How do people live? Well, in God's kingdom, how do people live. And you'll see when in terms of the world, it's almost polar opposite. And so you'll catch a lot of those themes. Matthew's gospel is also really big into the Old Testament. This, just as it was spoken by the prophets. I think they're in the infancy narrative of Christ. There's 7, I think.
I know there was a lot because I just read some of that this morning actually, and I was like, whoa, wait.
Right. Yeah. So that's and kind of talk about 6-day, 7-day kind of stuff. Here I wonder if there's something more to that. It's beyond the scope of what we got right now.
7's a big number in the Bible in general.
And you got the 14 generations too. For each one, there's 3 of those, and so the Bible does its numbers. And it's kind of a symmetrical kind of. It's very which lends to this is on purpose. This has been kind of God's intent. It hasn't been random chance, which is a big theme too. It's kind of intentional.
So is it another thing in Matthew? He's big on the use of the law, which kind of comes into I guess how you act in God's kingdom is you obey God's law.
Right.
And Jesus, that's what Jesus starts out with the Sermon on the Mount with. If you even look at a woman with lust, you've committed adultery, or if you hate your brother, you've committed murder. And so it's showing how the law really actually applies and how we really can't fulfill it. So
and then kind of that that high bar of the law. Well, then you hear that gospel, right? Because who is the one saying this? This is the one who's going to pay for all of that sin. Here's the one who has fulfilled it. Right? I have not come to abolish it, but to fulfill it, really to accomplish it. Which is, good news for you and me and everyone else here, right? That Christ comes to fulfill the law. So those are really big key. You could go even more into Matthew's gospel too.
Well, it was written to the Jews too, largely. Right. So that's kind of where you tie in a lot of the Old Testament, because the Jews would have known. That was their Bible, is our Old Testament, and so they would have known it well.
Yeah.
That was important to them, and so that's why there are a lot of references, I think, in Matthew to the Old Testament, because it's written to people who know the Old Testament.
Right. And that also, for us as Gentiles, that also teaches us that we need the Old Testament too. A lot of people will kind of just toss up like, what do we need this Old Testament for? Right?
Jesus came.
Because here's Matthew's gospel right here. Let's throw out all this, right? Yeah. And but we need this because it tells us how to look at the New Testament and what we're supposed to be seeing in the Old Testament too. So it's kind of key, and people forget that. Yeah. Good. So anything else from Matthew's gospel you think that we're missing here?
I think those are the highlights.
Yeah, I think so too.
People have questions. You can ask us questions about the Gospels too.
Yeah.
It doesn't just have to be the Old Testament or the main readings.
Right. And picking up all that. So and we're always kind of happy. So you can comment on the videos, send us stuff through email, all that stuff. We're glad to answer it. So good. All right. It's Genesis time.
Yes, Genesis chapter 19 through 35.
So where do we leave off with Genesis?
With Abraham pleading for Sodom. So we're going to start with the destruction of Sodom, which I think this is going to be in the document too, but I think this is a good time to talk about prescriptive versus descriptive in the Bible.
Have at it.
Okay. Basically, people get a little hung up on some of the stuff that happens in the Bible. It's like someone has multiple wives, and it's like, oh, the people have multiple wives in the Bible, God must think that's okay. Or, someone, what happens here shortly is that Lot's daughters get their father drunk and get pregnant by him. Yeah. And people think, oh no, that's, that's accepted in the Bible.
Go and do likewise, right? Yes,
and so you have to keep in mind that there's the descriptive stuff in the Bible, because the Bible to a certain extent is a history book. It's the history of God interacting with creation. Yeah. So some of this stuff just happened. And so it's describing what happened. Prescriptive is stuff we're told to do, basically.
Right.
So a lot of stuff happens in the Bible with no commentary over the morality of it, but we learn elsewhere in the Bible what's right and what's wrong, and we can apply that. So you can apply the 10 Commandments to these other stories and be like, that wasn't right, or that was right. And so it's important to keep that in mind, because there's some not so good stuff that happens in the Bible.
Right.
You get into Judges, and Israel was totally wayward at that point, and bad stuff happened, and that doesn't mean we're supposed to mimic it. It doesn't mean God approved of it. It just means that God, just with us, was patient with them, and they eventually, a lot of them did get punished. Exile happened, all that stuff, but it's just important to keep in mind.
Right, and and that tells you too that the Bible's not going to shy away from something that doesn't make it look good. Right. It's going to tell the true story about what the human heart is like, and just how sin has really corrupted man. But yeah, that's kind of always a good thing to keep in mind, especially in the book of Judges when we get to that, or the people's failings, is that you really got to read Deuteronomy into it, because when you understand here's what God has commanded his people to do, and all of a sudden you see them like the book of Judges, like that is the exact opposite, and so you start to see, well, this old covenant, this they're not really keeping up their end of the bargain here. So
that's you get into then, well, why is God punishing these people? Because they're not that bad. But it's like they literally knew what they were supposed to be doing and they weren't doing it. And I mean, God could have immediately been like, nope, you're done. And he gives it time. I mean, even Sodom was, I forget how many years, but I mean, it wasn't like immediately
judged.
Yeah, they had time to repent. We find that later in Jonah, where he goes to Nineveh and they repent. And they're spared, so it's
it's kind of Paul talk about now is the day of salvation kind of thing, right? There's like grab onto it now. Here's what God has gifted to us now. Don't wait, right? Because the final day of wrath comes, and so here's Jesus who saves us from that wrath. So kind of cling to him now.
Yeah.
Before
don't be thinking you have time.
Right.
Because you could die tomorrow, and the day of judgment could come for you tomorrow.
Right. So always be prepared for that. Kind of keep your eye on that final prize, as it were. So we pick up in Genesis here, chapter 19. Abraham has just pleaded for Sodom and Gomorrah to be spared if should be enough righteous people in the city. And of course, how many people do we find out that Abraham's concerned about? It's Lot, his wife, and then it's their 2 daughters. And then their 2 husbands, so there's 6, right? So sadly, we're short of the 10 needed. But God still is merciful, and he sends the angels to Sodom and Gomorrah there. They have a story that plays out later in the book of Judges. The same thing will happen there, which kind of will cue you in when you read this happening in Genesis. When you read that same kind of story that happens in Judges, you're like, whoa, hold on. Like,
that's the one where he cuts up the prostitute or whatever. Yeah, that's one of those not fun stories.
No, and that's when you read that, you're like, this is what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. And then the prophets will bring this up, and the prophet, like Isaiah, will call them, you are like Sodom, and you're like, oh, okay, right, that's not good, because we remember what happens here to Sodom, and so the people are unrighteous. And then the angels still have mercy, right? They're trying to get those whom are righteous out of the city. Well, we find out that the 2 husbands for Lot's daughters, they're like, whatever. So we're down to 4. And then, as they're leaving, poor Lot's wife looks back and, pillar of salt. Jesus will bring up that, right? Remember Lot's wife. Kind of like, do not kind of like have this hesitancy. And things like that. The prophets will actually bring that up, some of these images too.
I always wonder if there's a sense of like nostalgia with her, where it's like, oh, poor, we liked it there, or maybe not.
Almost like a longing for that which is there when you shouldn't have that longing. Yeah. So that leaves us with 3. So we got poor Lot and his 2 daughters there. And once again here, we have a salvation that's occurred, right? Lot and his family, which is now just his daughters, they've been spared, they've been saved, and now there's this talk about the fruit here that gets people in trouble in the book of Genesis. You had the fruit from the tree,
and then Noah getting drunk. So this is kind of a replay of Noah getting drunk after the flood, what happens here to Lot.
And so it's kind of like a trick, and then we get told that he is the daughter, the firstborn of these 2 children that come from the 2 daughters here, is one's Moab and the Ammonites, and they'll become enemies of God's people later. So they'll you kind of get the web of relationships here, which is kind of fun to see play out. But later on we'll see these characters and their people and their descendants kind of interact with each other, and things like that. So it's kind of always kind of fun to see. So good. So after we get done with Sodom and Gomorrah, where do we head off after that?
We get into more of Abraham and then the birth of Isaac.
Finally, right?
Finally.
Yeah. Because this chapter 21 is the birth of Isaac.
I think this is 13 years after the promise of him. I think it's over a decade. I think it's been 10 or 13 years, something like that.
It's somewhere, because Abraham's like 101, 100, something like that.
Yeah.
So imagine that, God, talk about God like being patient and waiting for his promises. You're going to have a son. Cool. 13 years later, right? Now imagine the waiting.
You're even older.
Right, and you makes you even like, great, well, how's this going to work out? Sarah, she's not looking any younger over there. How is this going to work out, God? So we see this kind of, Isaac is born, and this is kind of the promise. Here is God. Imagine, here's how God creates, and it just matches up perfectly with how God has always created. That which is dead, that which is barren, that which is void, out springs life. And it's all attached to God's. So God's trying to teach us that through his word comes life and forgiveness and restoration, right? So talk about how we're supposed to trust the Lord. Now, what do we have? We just have his word. But that's all that Adam and Eve had too at the beginning, right? Don't touch of this or lest you die. So all they have is that word from God that hold on to. Same with us. It's all people. So really at the last day, even though we'll see it, we'll still only have that word that we'll hold to, which is kind of fun to think about too. Words are important.
So connected with the barren womb, the ultimate example of this, of course, is Mary giving birth to Jesus, the virgin giving birth. So it's the ultimate barren womb, really.
Yeah.
Because obviously, Sarah was married, so child is a possibility, whereas Mary, virgin,
right?
That's the ultimate example of God bringing forth life from a barren womb.
Right. So it defies that biology, kind of, as we know, and just like creation itself, the very act of creation is in defiance with that biology, kind of, as God creates, which is kind of fascinating to think about. God's word calls to that which is not. Paul will do that in Romans and 1 Corinthians, and onwards you go. So good stuff. God, there's also a problem then with Hagar and Ishmael. They are sent away, right? And why are they sent away? It's probably always one of those kind of sticky things too.
Sarah was jealous, essentially, because
right.
now she had, which it's her own fault because she's the one who told Abraham to sleep with Hagar, but
right.
So she's essentially, because, well, apparently, the brother relationship again, too, apparently, I think, doesn't it say Ishmael was, not whatever.
Right.
So you get a little bit of that.
Yeah, it's just kind of interesting. And, we could go into all the interests that Paul will do this in Galatians, right? He'll compare Hagar and Ishmael with the slave. The slave does not inherit the household. And Paul will make that connection with the law, right? Those who want to try to get God's promises by their works or the fulfilling of the law on their own terms, right, will be sent away because they don't remain in the house forever because they're trying to be slaves instead of just being made God's son.
So I think people misunderstand that path because Paul wrote that about Hagar and then not the son of the promise, and I think people think it's looking down on Hagar, and it's not really. It's just kind of a image of that, not
right. Yeah. So to get all this, you get treaties with Abimelech here. That's kind of that's kind of a fun point we touch on. But we should probably, as we push forward, because there's a very important chapter.
Yes.
So Isaac is born. So 13 years. Imagine, Danny, you waited 13 years for something in your life to come to you, and then all of a sudden you get it, and then someone comes to you and says, "Hey, I'm gonna take that away." What would you think?
I would be very confused and probably not too happy.
I'm sure. God comes, chapter 22, right? Very, very well known, even among, non-Christians and things like that. They know that the near sacrifice of Isaac, right? It's always called the sacrifice of Isaac, but really should call it the near sacrifice of Isaac because he actually doesn't get it, which gets into the kind of the point here. But it's the land of Moriah. This later becomes the place where the temple is built too. So they kind of
isn't it the same hill?
Same hill. So Mount Zion, this is Mount Zion that they're going to, right? Where the temple's at, where all these sacrifices in the future are going to be done at. And here God says, take Isaac there and go offer him up.
Your only son.
A son that you love, right? Which
sound familiar?
Sounds very familiar, right? It's you get this at the baptism, right? So all of a sudden, you're my beloved son, right? And he says, God the Father says to Jesus. So really, once again, we see the dynamic playing out in the New Testament. Here in the Old Testament, God's just really saying, hey guys, this is really about my son. Here's what I'm going to do.
And so even in this story, God provides the sacrifice.
Yeah.
Because obviously Abraham doesn't sacrifice Isaac, and God provides a ram. Is it a ram? Yeah, it's a ram. For the actual sacrifice. So again, God provides the sacrifice. God provides Jesus, the ultimate sacrifice.
Right. And just kind of tying this to the similarities, but also the dissimilarities too, because that really heightens attention. Here, Isaac is spared, the one who's called the beloved son, But in the New Testament, Jesus, who is the beloved Son, is not spared, right? Who instead gets spared? Well, we do. So this is a beautiful thing. So really, this story is about Christ, right? We see what Jesus has done for us. He's been offered up in our stead.
Well, even Isaac carrying the wood is like Jesus carrying the cross.
It's just a beautiful imagery, right? Which also tells you, right, because this is a whole burnt offering, and this isn't like here's a few sticks for a sacrifice we're going to light up here, right? To whole burn something to ashes, you need a lot of wood. Almost need kind of a cartload. So Isaac is not like this 5-year-old boy being offered, to God here. He's probably like a teenager. He's probably like a strapping young boy. 15, 16, 18, who knows? But yeah, so you kind of get this image of he's willingly doing this, right? He kind of gets it. So we also get this image of faith. Abraham trusts God. We see this in Hebrews 11 again, right?
Yeah.
With
even the word what he says in here that God will provide or whatever. It seems like Abraham has this idea that even if he has to go through and sacrifice Isaac, that God can raise him from the dead. He seems to trust that fact that he'll get Isaac back anyway.
Right. Which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. So then it gets done. They come back. What a relief, right? And it's kind of like God's promises are still on. And Abraham, of course, because we said he knows this the whole time.
Yeah. He seems to starting to be getting it a little bit more. Because you get earlier on with Abraham that he doesn't seem to quite get what,
how's this going to look?
Yeah. Now it's almost like he's starting to get it a little bit.
Yeah.
He gets a little better anyway.
Right. And talk about that in our Christian walk, right? It's even when we mess up and we just kind of fail time and time again, here's a God who works with very sinful people, and even almost in times in spite of them will accomplish his deeds. So good stuff. And then after 22 is where we kind of get the passing of the torch, the fading away of the first descendants here of the book of Genesis has been picking up with Abraham. You get Sarah's death and her burial, right? She lived 127 years. Then Abraham has to buy a tomb for her, which becomes the place where other patriarchs are going to be buried later on in Genesis 2. And with that, you kind of get this, kind of the passing of an era. I do believe Sarah does not want her son Isaac to receive a child and Abraham does too, but it's kind of like that final wish, like don't let my son marry a person from our tribe or family kind of thing, like Ishmael, because he married an Egyptian and it caused hardship in the family and things like that.
There's a lot of that in the Bible of people. I mean, that's reiterated later in the law, that you should take a basically non-Israelite wife, when obviously the Israelites didn't exist yet. I guess these are the patriarchs of the Israelites, but you get with the Israelites that anytime that someone takes a wife from outside of the Israelites, it usually leads them astray. It causes a lot of problems. I mean, look at Solomon for one example. And so I think Sarah was very smart here saying that.
So the question becomes then, why? Right? Why is it so important? So what do you think? Why is it so important that they can't marry? Why shouldn't Isaac marry outside the family line? Why was it a problem that the sons of God were marrying the daughters of men early on in Genesis 6?
Well, some of it, isn't it the kind of the preservation of the line that the Savior will come from?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the whole point of a lot of the Old Testament laws, actually, is to keep the Israelites as a separate people, because from there, the Messiah would come, and it means more. There's more meaning behind it. People recognized it, or didn't recognize it, but some people recognized it because they knew all this.
Yeah, so that's
one of the reasons.
It's the survival of God's promise that he made. So as we've been tracing in Genesis here, will this promise that God made, that through this seed, God will conquer the serpent and fix the creation, will that survive? And you see here through Genesis how God's working out. So it becomes important that it must come from this family, and it can't be just diluted and dissolved, which becomes, later on, the northern tribes, they vanish. And all that's left is Judah. Well, you kind of have that promise that's been kind of carried through too, which we'll get to because you got to trace the promise. So right now, the promise belongs to Abraham, and now it's being passed on to Isaac. This promise of a future descendant who will bless the nations, which is Jesus. So we push forward then, chapter 24. What starts happening here? What's that whole point? That really long chapter 24
That's
is.
when Abraham's servant goes and gets a wife for Isaac. So it's this whole big long how he went and did it and how God showed him who it should be, and there's the whole thing with the well and drawing water, and wells become important.
Wells are very important in the Old Testament. Moses, right? He'll come to a family at the well and save them from some bad shepherds. Jacob will have some well experiences too. Jesus, the New Testament, the John chapter 4. So there's kind of this idea that almost salvation happens around kind of wells, and he's the well of salvation. This kind of idea. Water,
living water.
Yeah.
Water is a big thing. I mean, the world was created out of water too.
Right.
It was washed by the flood and water. There's baptism, water. Water is a very important thing.
It is. And talk about another kind of important thing in the Old Testament that we're going to read again. Because you read chapter 24, and Abraham says, I want you to do this. And then the servant goes and he'll start doing that. And then, he'll run into these people, and then he'll kind of reiterate the story again. And they're like, oh, and then they'll tell like a third time. So all of a sudden, like in this one chapter, you get like the story being told like again and again and again and again. And you'll get this a lot in the Old Testament where you're like, I feel like I just read that like 5 times. And like these people are saying the same thing over and over, which one kind of tells the importance of kind of a memory, how people kind of operated. But 2, kind of even with our faith, right? We're going to gather Thursday and tomorrow night, and we're going to gather Sunday morning. And we're saying the same story again and again and again. So it's kind of like, here's how God works. And so it's kind of like this repetition is kind of built into here, and the text is kind of teaching us that. There's a
sense sometimes that repetition is bad, but repetition is how you remember things.
Right.
I know that's how I've memorized anything, is you just repeat it over and over and over again. And
it sticks.
Yeah.
What is it? Variety is the spice of life, but repetition is its sustenance. So
repetition isn't always bad,
right?
Because it's, especially for kids, passing it on, repetition is really good, because they start picking it up, because especially young kids, they can't read. A lot of these stories were actually, they weren't all written down, immediately, right. And so they were passed orally, a lot of them, and that's
kind of like sit down, and that becomes like what you teach your kids, right? All right, son, sit down. I'm going to tell you the story of my father and his father and what we've gone through. And guess what? You're going to have your chat, your parts. You're going to sit down with your son one day and say, all right, listen to the story of my father. And just kind of go from there, which kind of tells you the importance it is of the life that these families are going through, and how God is working through this story too to accomplish his purposes too. So that's chapter 24, right? Isaac gets married to Rebecca. And so it's kind of, with this now set in mind, kind of we have the pieces in place. Chapter 25, where do we go from there?
That's when Abraham dies.
Yeah, so the passing of Abraham that we've been following since chapter 12. This is kind of an important segment in the book. Talk about kind of how you can chunk the book of Genesis here. You got chapters 1 through 11, and now chapters 12 through 25. Because now with the death of Abraham, we focus a little bit. We don't get too much on Isaac.
No.
We only get a couple chapters, which is kind of always been like curious, because he's been promised for like 10 chapters, and now he's finally here. And then you only focus on him for like 2 or 3 chapters, and then boom, he's gone.
Because you go right into his sons then.
So you don't get too many like stories that just focus on Isaac himself.
Except for the sacrifice.
Right, except for the which is the birthright and the things like that. So what happens? Isaac has married to Rebecca, and what are their kids then?
It would be Jacob and Esau, who are twins.
And what do you
know anything about that?
What do I think about twins? Sometimes the bickering because they're brothers, but also the care that and their kind of that fierceness too. I love the stories that kind of come out, because what's Jacob doing when he's getting born? I just kind of love that. It's just.
He's grasping Esau's heel. This is the one where Jacob doesn't his hand stick out first? Is that a different story? There's 2 sets of twins.
Yeah, I think that might be. I
might be getting my twins mixed up.
That might be Judah's. I don't know. Yeah, what is that? We'll get to it. I'm sure we will. Once again, right, as we've been talking about how these stories all like, wait a minute, yes. I've read this before, which is a good thing. This is what the text wants you to do. So you get
it's not them. That was someone else.
Okay. You get Esau comes out, and Esau means hairy, ruddy. So Esau's probably comes out very just covered in like hair, and he's very red. It's kind of almost blood color.
Well, that's why he's also called Edom,
Right.
which means red, where you get the Edomites, and
Yep.
I was wondering actually if the Red Sea isn't named after him because maybe his people, I wondered if
Right.
that's
They kind of
maybe.
settled in that area.
Yeah, I had that thought last time I read through. I forget
Interesting.
what I was reading through. Maybe it was the Gospels or something where there's something about Edomites and living,
Right.
So
And
one of those random
Right. And
possibilities.
there's a wordplay with that the prophets will pick up on. Edom also in Hebrew, especially too. It mimics Adam, Edom, Adam. And so the other prophets will make note that Edom will sometimes represent mankind as a whole. The Obadiah will do this actually, and he'll point that out. So that's kind of a little fun thing for later on, but good to note here too. So here the Edomites come from Esau, and we also get Jacob, and Jacob's name I always kind of love it, right? He who grasps the heel, but also can someone who is a trickster, deceiver. And we find out in the Old Testament too, people either live up to their names or they fail to live up to their names. So that's kind of a fun little note here too.
Jacob does kind of live up to his name, the deceiver.
Yeah, because what are some of the things that he does? I always kind of enjoy that too.
He first steals the birthright from Esau and then the blessing from Esau. So he steals the birthright by Esau coming in and basically wanting food. He's famished, and Jacob's like, "Sell me your birthright." And so Jacob gets his birthright, and then later he tricks his father, who can't see very well anymore, into thinking that he's Esau. So he gives him the blessing. And this has caused major strife between the two brothers, and Jacob runs off for a while. So brotherly love.
Right. And so Esau's just Jacob's doing a great job of tricking people and things like that. But we also get here's Edom. You talk about the promise that God has given, the seed, right, the birthright, and here Edom, he's hungry, and he just comes in and says, "What's a birthright to me? I'm hungry right now." Right. So Esau is so short-sighted that he doesn't see the blessings of the birthright, that he just says, "Whatever, have at it. I just want a lunch." And you get this later on.
It's the despising of it.
Yeah, here's God. You're going to be the one whom God was going to choose to kind of carry on the promise of the Messiah. And guess what? You just said, "No thanks." This will come up with Judah's sons. Actually, Onan. That's why he's put to death, because he does not want to carry on the family line. And he's put to death, because he just flat out rejected the faith that God would save the family through this seed.
So children are really important in the Bible.
Yeah.
Because you reject that, you're rejecting the promise, which is Jesus.
Right.
And so that goes all the way back to the beginning: be fruitful and multiply. So when you're rejecting children, which happens nowadays too, you're rejecting God's blessing, God's promise.
Right. Which speaking of that too, God built into mankind what would come, his son, right? And here you get that, Genesis 2, God establishes that. But even as the text moves forward and into the New Testament, even still, Paul will connect this, right? That with women, they will be saved through child, not because they have kids is how they're saved, but they're participating in just how Jesus was brought into the world, right? So it's kind of God's opportunity for us to participate in his life too. And it's kind of one of those things to think about too. Good. All right, so God, he sells his birthright. God makes a promise. Chapter 26, God makes a promise now to Isaac. He says, this was Abraham's, now it's yours, Isaac. This is what belongs to you. Of course, we're going to get this moving on with Jacob as well. But what else do you see in the text that just kind of sticks out to you as we push forward?
I've always been curious, maybe you can answer this as a question. I guess, how could Jacob steal the blessing, and why can Isaac only give one?
All right. Well, you'll get this later on too with Jacob, right? The one who was the younger getting the blessing. And then when Joseph brings his two boys up front, right? And Jacob will cross his arms and give the younger one the blessing, say the older is going to serve the younger. But that's just kind of, you only have one blessing, right? There's kind of even today, right? He doesn't just split it up, but it's not like he can split up the promise, as it were. There's only one Messiah. There's only one kind of, I guess you want to say, birthright in that sense. But that was also tied to the possessions that they had too, right? So the one who is going to carry on the promise of God should also get all the resources too, to fully support and carry on, God's work. And And yeah,
But
so
technically, since Jacob already had stolen the birthright or gotten the birthright, he should have been the one to get the blessing anyway.
yeah. And we just talk about how this is interesting too, right? That God honors that choice. It's not like God says, whoa, right? That was a start over kind of thing. That actually God works through that. So even through this sin, this tricking and lying, God still does his thing, which, blows our heads because we're just like, how can God side with that?
Well, you get that later
Yeah.
with, is it Judah who ends up sleeping with a prostitute who turns out to be
Yeah.
his daughter-in-law? And from that's where the line continues through.
Yeah. So God works through this really corrupt family to achieve his ends. So, it's kind of one of those things that, this doesn't justify the behavior or anything like that, but yet God will still use that to carry on and talk about, Jesus carrying in his body the sins of his people, right? He's also carrying these sins, literally, like he's the spawn from this sin.
He's carrying their genes.
Yeah. So it's kind of, talk about him who's carried our offenses and everything like that, and our iniquities. It's kind of, kind of a cool thought.
It's kind of the idea nowadays where people say, well, God can make something good come out of a bad situation.
Right.
This is literally how he makes something good happen out of a bad situation.
Yeah, right. Which you can always slip into that theodicy because some people try to use that to justify God. Oh, that means something good's going to come out. It's like, well, that doesn't mean that what happened was good, right? But that God can work that something good out of it. We'll get that with Joseph at the end of the book, right? Joseph will summarize all of these thoughts here with, you meant this for evil, but God ended up using it for good, so that many people would be kept alive, right? That's kind of Joseph's conclusion to all this sin. God will use this to bring about good, which ultimately does through Christ.
Doesn't make what they did good, but it makes the result, I guess, the unintended result was good.
It's a sudden grace, an unexpected, undeserved grace, right? It's this is Jesus, right? Because people are like, well, of course Jesus has got to come. He's going to do this. Well, he does, but it's not like I deserved him to come and give me grace. This is something that, against all the odds, God has come and he's worked this. Praise be to God that this has happened. So, if that makes kind of sense. I don't know if that kind of answers your question, but at least gives you food for thought with it.
That makes more sense.
But it is something that maybe should give us pause and we stop to realize just how kind of wild God is, that he's not tame, that he doesn't just play with our preconceived notions of how things should work out.
God can't be put in a box.
Right. And he's just going to act the way he's going to act. And guess what? Because he's God. Which is a little bit terrifying because, right, he can do what he pleases. But yeah, good. So that's the blessing that Jacob gets. He gets all the blessings. Esau, he begs for the blessing, right? And what does he get? You're pretty much going to get the opposite of your brother Isaac. And then of course, what's the result of this? If you had your let's do it. Kaylin stole your birthright. What would you do? How would you feel about that?
I wouldn't be too happy.
Okay. Yeah. That's
not good for sister relationships.
Right. Which notice this too. Now, as a pastor, in our own families, I will see all the time families after a member has died, the kids fight over the stuff, and it tears families apart. Here we are in Genesis. Here, this is happening.
Yeah, death can be one of the worst things for family relationships.
Yep.
Should bring them together, but
it tears them right apart. Yep. And so which is also going to start a crisis in the book of Genesis that will be answered a little bit later when Jacob and Esau reunite. So kind of then look at the next couple chapters. What happens to Jacob? Why does he leave? Where does he go? What does he do?
Well, Esau wanted to kill him, basically. Yeah. So Rebecca tells him to go off to her relatives. And then Isaac essentially says the same thing to Jacob as he was told to go off and, get a wife from, don't marry a Canaanite.
Go back home, which is where Abraham got a wife for Isaac. Now here's, Jacob going back to that family. It's almost kind of going back to your roots a little bit here. So,
so Jacob goes and gets a wife. He works for a wife. He falls in love with Rachel and says he'll work for 7 years. And that doesn't work out too well for him because at the end of the 7 years, he's tricked into marrying Leah and then gets Rachel too and has to work another 7 years.
The trickster has been tricked.
Yes. which is another interesting thing. How did he not know he didn't have the right woman? But
right, yeah. It's kind of like the Cinderella with the glass shoe. How's the guy?
The original story where the stepsister's given because she cut off her toes to fit into the shoe, and if you remember, the original version of Cinderella is very graphic actually, because the stepsister cut off their toes or their heel to fit into the shoe, and the prince goes off, and then all of a sudden they realize the shoe's bloody.
Right.
That's just totally a sidetrack there, but
it fairy tales are especially in medieval times where all these biblical stories are going, like this.
Especially if you go to the original fairy tales.
Right.
If you read the original Brothers Grimm, they're a lot darker and a lot more.
Good. Rebecca's actually read them all now, and
okay,
she's enjoyed that. But an important thing too, what happens to Jacob is God will appear to Jacob a lot during these chapters too. Like you get the ladder from heaven, which will be John 1, that God has now revealed himself. And that Jacob, Isaac was the one who had the promise, but now Jacob is the one who's continuing on with this promise from God. And so, even though he's going to go through like a lot of hard situations here, and 14 years, 20 years of him being away, pretty much, God promises to be with him and to carry him through all this. He marries Rachel and Leah, or you get that, and then what comes from that, right? Because he marries the two sisters here, and then what comes from that? Talk about another family conflict. What happens?
Talking about all the pregnancies.
Yeah.
So basically, Leah starts giving birth to children, which I always find it interesting that Jacob wanted to marry Rachel, but it's actually from Leah that Judah comes, and Judah's who Jesus comes from.
Right.
But so basically, Leah has a bunch of children, and then Rachel's like, I'm not having any children, and so she does the whole give her maidservant to her husband, and then
Hagar again
has a couple of children, and then Leah stops having children, so she's like, here, take my maidservant. And then finally Rachel has a child, and that would be Joseph.
Yeah. And talk about still how God is working through this family mess. You're going to see us again in the book of Samuel, right? When Hannah wants to have a child, and her the husband's other wife, I forget his name, is it Paran or something like that, and he he looks at her and is like, aren't I worth more than 10 sons to you? And the answer in the text is no. She wants a son and things like that. So you kind of see this struggle and what comes from Hannah, Samuel.
Again, this is maybe an example of the descriptive versus prescriptive with the polygamy kind of idea. That multiple wives happens in the Bible, but it is never a good thing.
Right.
It always leads to problems. I mean, it leads to problems here. It led to problems with Sarah and Hagar. It just always leads to problems. And so really God's design for marriage is one man, one woman. Not the one man and multiple women, because it never does end well.
Nope. And one of the things, so, Rachel's the favorite, and who are the two children born from her?
That'd be Joseph and Benjamin.
Which is going to lead us into the text of more family conflict from this, right? You got the brothers who are from Leah and the servants here, and they are not treated like Joseph, and later on Benjamin.
Joseph's the favorite youngest child until Benjamin comes along later, but
right, he's the favorite son from the favorite wife, and that's going to lead to the end of the book of Genesis here too. But we first, we got to cover more of Jacob's story. So Jacob has all this happen. He gets prosperous, right? Because he cheats, he tricks Laban here out of his flocks.
Interesting story of the flocks with the spots and not spots.
Yeah.
Some people find this strange, but I was actually reading a book right now, In Search of the Genesis World, and in some of the science and such, it goes into evolution and stuff like that. But it was saying in there about how there are actually examples, even nowadays, where animals are born a certain way that you wouldn't guess from the genetics based on the environment. So if certain minerals or something are in the soil, animals can be born like with a different colored coat. I thought that, so I thought of this story actually where he puts the branches or whatever in the feeding troughs of some of the animals, so they don't, so the strong ones are speckled and the weak ones aren't. So apparently there is actually some science behind this, which I thought was interesting. Yeah,
because usually, a lot of people say, well, this tells us this is a bunch of baloney. But it's something
it was something like, I was like, I wonder if that's connected to that.
Interesting.
Just an interesting side science point.
Cool.
Anyway, then Jacob flees with his flocks, and then Laban catches up to him.
Which is kind of, here's a fun little sidebar in the text in chapter 31, verse 36. Jacob became angry and berated Laban. Jacob said to Laban, "What is my offense?" This becomes also the word for what is my transgression. Because here they're close family relations, and the word transgression, right? It's always one of those things where like, what in the world is that? It's like, I trusted you while Rebecca and I were gone away from home, and I said, here's the key. Could you make sure the mail's brought in and the plants be watered and things like that? Because I trust you to do that, and then all of a sudden I came back and you had stolen everything from our house, right? That'd be a transgression because I trusted you. It's not like I just gave some random guy on the street and said, hey, take care of my house, right? I should probably expect my house to be robbed, right? It's just kind of one of those things where, I trusted someone specifically to do something and it didn't happen. That'd be a betrayal, right? So Judas kind of has that. He has a betrayal. He has a transgression with someone who's close to him. So it's kind of interesting. So that's, Jacob's, what is my offense? What is my transgression against you? So that's just a fun little Hebrew sidebar word there. But so anyway, we're told that chapter 32, Jacob's finally on his way back home. He kind of gets the blessings. We get the fun story about, is it Leah sitting on the household gods, or is that Rachel?
I think it's Leah.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Because that's why Laban was kind of chasing him too.
Because one of them stole the household gods, which were basically
Rachel.
statues.
Rachel did it. Yep. Which is kind of fun too, because it tells you how impotent these false gods are. That Laban has to go searching for them when here God is the one that searches, when he can't find them because you can almost picture Rachel sitting on them and they're going and they can't get out of their own predicament. Which is just kind of it's funny. That should make us laugh when we read it. That you're sitting there like, oh, these gods can't even save themselves.
Okay.
Good.
Then we get into Jacob wrestling with God, which is another one of those curious stories. You're wondering a little bit how that looked almost.
Right.
Is this pre-incarnate Jesus that he's actually literally wrestling with? Or,
and why does he go out by himself? You ever thought about that? Because what's about to happen?
Well, he's about to meet Esau, and he sends he sends him to the other side of the river or something, doesn't he?
Try to spare, right? Maybe if he can save some of the family here.
He's thinking, is that right before that he splits up his family, and because he's worried that Esau is going to attack him, kill him.
Right.
Not sure how it's going to go. Yep.
And so you see, he names a place Peniel, which becomes very important later on in the prophets. They'll kind of word play on this word with I saw God face to face kind of thing. Here's Jacob. He's expecting to go off all night, kind of maybe prayer, and he ends up wrestling. So he does end up praying. So this is kind of the Bible's image for prayer and things like that. He's renamed Israel, which one who struggles, one who strives with God and succeeds, because Israel, Jacob, he does succeed. And striving with God. And what does he demand? Did you catch that? Like, what's the thing he demands from God?
He wants to know his name.
Wants to know his name, and he says, "I won't let you go unless you bless me," which tells us already kind of what Jacob, who he thinks this guy is, he's been wrestling with, right? I will not let you go unless you bless me. Which already in the book of Genesis, God has blessed people, especially now with Jacob being terrified to meet Esau. So Esau finally comes. And what happened? This is probably my favorite story.
Yeah,
in the book
this
of Genesis.
reminds me of the prodigal son.
Okay.
Because it's the same kind of idea that the prodigal son goes off. I guess Jacob didn't squander his wealth, but he comes back wealthy. But he kind of comes back with that trepidation of not expecting to be welcomed. And Esau runs out and embraces him and welcomes him back and forgives him.
Yeah.
So it's like it subverts expectations. You're expecting Esau to be still mad, and he's just happy to see his brother.
Yep. And I love even the language is ambiguous up until the moment when it tells you they're embracing and kissing, and they're rolling on the ground, because you almost get this image because we're thinking Esau's angry. That's all we know. And so you can imagine like Esau's running up and you think he's like charging at like tackle him to the ground, which is exactly, he wraps them up, they fall to the ground, and you're thinking this is when the knife comes out and boom. You're thinking Cain and Abel almost here. But instead you get where all of a sudden they're on the ground laughing and just they're happy to see each other.
This has been a while too, because if you think about it, he worked for over 7 years for Rachel, or for Leah technically then, and 7 years for Rachel. And then he also has more for the flocks. I mean, all of his children have been born at this point.
Yeah. So you're thinking this is over 20, maybe 30 years.
Yeah. So it's been a while since they've seen each other, actually.
Yeah. And so this kind of reunion, it turns out well, but then they do part ways. They kind of go their separate ways. It's almost kind of, I always kind of felt this almost along, maybe you should have, kind of like, he's like, come with me. And he's like, no. And then he kind of splits up and they go their own way.
That's kind of what happened with Abraham and Lot, too. They split up because their flocks were too big, and then Lot gets into trouble, too. Right. So
which is what they'll get into trouble, too, because what happens, the Edomites will kind of come from this, too. And you'll see more family conflicts in the years to come, and the generations to come. Well, then we move on from there. Jacob, as his story starts kind of wrapping up, so we go through chapter 35 this week. So chapter 34 is a very curious story about they have a little sister, Dinah here, who is the daughter of Leah. And we're told that when they come into one of the cities here, was it Shechem? When Shechem, the son of Hamor, so it's the prince of the land, saw her, right? He humiliates her, so kind of this idea of a rape here. And she's defiled, and the brothers are really upset, and so they devise a really kind of just like father like sons here. We're kind of getting some of their character. What do?
They convince they know what happened, and so what is it? Shechem wants basically they go to and say, give her as my wife, not realizing, I think maybe that they knew what happened to her, and they're like, well, you need to be circumcised.
Right.
And so they're like, okay, we'll get circumcised, and then while they're recovering from their circumcisions, the brothers come and basically kill all of them.
Right. So they bring them into the covenant, and they also kind of make a covenant with them. So it's kind of like, this is a peace treaty that they've made, not to hurt each other or to go to war over something like this. And here we find out that Simeon and Levi, the second born and the third born, completely disregard their father, right? They kind of, Jacob has kind of almost no idea about any of this. And they go against his wishes, cheat, and then murder this whole town, and then which creates more problems because now Jacob can't live in this land anymore. This is the promised land. And so now they have to leave and depart. So if you're kind of keeping score on the blessings here, you got the oldest son, which is... who's the oldest son? It's Reuben. Reuben's the oldest. Yeah. So he's still good until, of course, we get a little bit later here because we find out that is it chapter 35.
I think that's a little later. That's after Joseph.
Yeah, because we find out that Reuben's defiling his father's bed too. So he's sleeping with women in his father's house. And so here's the blessing. So Reuben gets kind of out of the will. And then Simeon and Levi, for what they do here in chapter 34, they get out of the will. So who's the next one?
They're up to Judah.
Judah, which is why he becomes the one who gets the promise and the blessing. So which that's kind of put into the air in chapter 37 there at first when he gets into some trouble too. But we still see how that we'll see how that works out for him. But so chapter 34 and chapter 35, we kind of get another passing of another marker here that changes.
Yeah, you get a little bit of the reiteration of the promise, and then the deaths of Rachel and Isaac. Rachel dies in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin.
And what you want to name him? I was
Ben-Oni.
Yeah, which is son of my suffering. Trouble. Yeah, son of my trouble. And of course, Benjamin is
son of my right hand.
Yeah, so you kind of get his, here's Jacob. He's the last parent here. His mother's died, and he no, he's not going to be son of my trouble. He's going to be son of my right hand. Here he views Benjamin very highly here too. Another precious son from his favorite wife. We get Rachel's tomb here. A pillar is put up there, and of course, more traveling and things like that. So kind of, and Isaac, he breathes this last too. So you got he lives 180 years.
So I find it interesting that Isaac's been alive during all this.
Right.
So you're wondering how he played into the Jacob-Esau drama.
Yeah.
But.
Yeah. And I love that you had this too when Abraham died. Ishmael and Isaac buried Abraham, their father, together. And here at the end of chapter 35, our last chapter here for this week, we're told in verse 29, Isaac breathed his last, and he died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So it's kind of like they come back together again, and they're able to kind of bury their father, just as they just got done burying the hatchet, as it were. So
that's kind of where we end this week then.
Yeah, so that's
we get into Joseph, and Joseph takes us through the end of Genesis. Do we finish Genesis next week?
we do finish it, and we start Acts next week too. So we'll have some fun with
Genesis
that.
is one of the longer books in the Bible.
Yeah, 50 chapters.
If you can finish Genesis, you're off to a good start.
Right. So yeah, that's where we're at. So this week, of course, I forgot to say at the beginning, read chapters 19 through 35 of Genesis, and then read Matthew chapter 5 through 8, and then also we'll continue with the Psalms 4 through 6. And the Psalms, of course, right, they're prayers, and so it's just kind of a good time to stop and reflect, which may be able to kind of help you kind of, as we read through this text, kind of hit some of those key points.
There are some themes that show up, and I actually found it interesting reading the Psalms more, consistently last year, that it says a lot about the character of God in the Psalms. So if you really want to know what God is like, read the Psalms.
Right. Yeah. Good. You got anything else that?
I think that's good for the week.
All right. Well, hey, blessings to you guys as you continue to digest and dig into God's word. Here's a blessing for you. As God blesses people, so we receive these blessings still. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. Amen.